Great to see you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for your patience as we get everything situated. My name is Mike Butterworth. I'm the director of the Center for Sports Communication and Media, part of the Moody College of Communication. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2023 McGarr Symposium on Sports and Society. The symposium is one of the center's signature events, and it aims to spotlight the role of sports and sports culture and their impact on American society. Previous events have included a discussion of doping in elite cycling, conversation about race and civil rights, a multi-panel discussion about head injuries in football, a panel on the future of sports radio and podcasting, and a discussion of the relationship between sports and humor. The McGarr Symposium also supports our annual Frank DeFord Lecture in Sports Journalism, and recent speakers have included Bob Costas, Andrea Joyce, Mina Kimes, Howard Bryant, and Christine Brennan. Now, the McGarr Symposium owes its name to Cappy McGarr. You may know the Cafe Cappies downstairs. That's the same Cappy. And I want to thank him for his tireless efforts on behalf of his alma mater and the Moody College of Communication. It was his gift years ago that launched our initial curriculum and programming in sports journalism, and that has led us to where we are now. A two-time UT alumnus, Cappy has enjoyed a distinguished career in business and politics, and among his many accomplishments, he is the founder of the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor, an honor first bestowed in 1998. And the 2023 prize was just awarded to Adam Sandler only 2 nights ago, and his commitment to that event prevents Cappy from being here today, but I want to make sure that we thank him in spirit. And let me also say thank you to the many who have helped make this event possible today. Our Dean, Dr. Jay Bernhardt, the Center's Program Manager, Christopher Hart, our Communications Specialist, Madison Morris, all of our Center for Sports Communication and Media affiliates, our tech team led by Keith Berner, and Jeff Hunt and his students who have graciously shared the space with us today. And my thanks to all of you for being here. We're, of course, thrilled that our guest, Dave Zirin, Dave's back there, prepared to get a formal introduction soon. Our guest, Dave Zirin, is here with us today. It is his film, Behind the Shield, The Power and Politics of the NFL, that provides the platform for our discussion today. I'll introduce Dave formally after the film, which we'll screen in just a moment. But as you likely know, the National Football League is the most successful and influential sports league in the United States. Sportico estimates that league revenues in 2021 were over $11 billion, and just sponsorships alone in 2022 were nearly $2 billion. The league dominates television ratings, with nearly all of the top annual broadcasts being football games, led, of course, by the annual Super Bowl. Super Bowl 57 last month averaged just around 113 million viewers, a number that dwarfs any other broadcast. For perspective, a few years ago there was a lot of hubbub about the series finales of both The Big Bang Theory and Game of Thrones, both of which drew roughly 18 to 19 million viewers, compared to 113 million viewers in the United States. And of course, we also know that the NFL takes up the majority of oxygen in the sports media ecosystem. Even in the midst of March Madness, the World Baseball Classic, the push to the playoffs in the NBA and the NHL, we all still get up-to-the-minute updates on the April NFL Draft and the psyche of Aaron Rodgers. In short, the NFL is the most powerful entity in U.S. sports, and that power is leveraged in myriad ways. Behind the Shield offers a critical evaluation of the league and its various political commitments. In spite of any claim that it may want to stick to sports, the NFL reflects and shapes political issues connected to nationalism, militarism, gender, race, public health, and more. Marked by Dave Zirin's well-established attention to the interrelationships between sports organizations, media, and fans, Behind the Shield may not tell you exactly what to think, but it will give you much to think about. Now, one note on behalf of Dave, he asked me to share this with you. There are a number of depictions of violence in the film, violence connected to the game itself, but violence also in association with state violence, with gendered violence, and those may provoke some uncomfortable responses, and we totally get it. If you need to step aside for a moment, we do hope you'll come back, but just want to give you a fair warning about that content ahead of time. Other than that, please enjoy the film. and stay with us for a discussion with Dave Zirin, which will follow afterward, including a Q&A session. Thank you all for being here.
Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a bitch off the field right now, out, he's fired.
Over the past few years, the National Football League has been attacked for allowing itself to be politicized by rebel athletes and media members.
These hyper left-wing values, it's disruptive to the culture of football.
I pay my money to watch them play football. I don't come out to watch a political rally.
Americans don't want politics shoved down their throat in football. They want beer and wings shoved down their throat.
We're not looking to get into politics. What we're looking to do is continue to keep people focused on football.
What's gotten a lot less attention is all the ways that NFL football has been politicized on behalf of the power establishment all along. How for decades it's been pumping out messages that are impossible to separate from politics, whether people want to see them as political or not. The fact is, the National Football League, more than any other major American sport, has explicitly built its brand on a whole complex of images and messages that have helped shape everything from dominant ideas about patriotism, militarism, and war.
Their war is a lonely war that has emerged in part in the trenches.
To gender norms and our conception of American manhood.
What does the NFL stand for? Masculinity, strength, toughness.
Something tells me, Gavin, that you think football, you should let them hit each other.
Of course you should. It's the American way.
Yeah.
Oh, concussion, schmushing, they ought to call it.
To the politics of race and the history of racism and segregation in America. To the meaning and place of money and corporate power in U.S. society. And I'd argue that whether we're football fans or not, or even sports fans, we all have a stake in understanding this side of the political equation and just how powerful the NFL has become as a cultural and political force in this country.
But one thing about the NFL, politics are not good for us in any way.
Dave Zirin is the creator of Edge of Sports website and podcast, sports editor at The Nation magazine, the first ever to be appointed to such a role, and the author of 11 books about sports and culture in the United States. Those books include What's My Name, Fool? Sports and Resistance in the United States, The People's History of Sports in the United States, and The Capitalism, as well as collaborative projects featuring sports leaders such as Muhammad Ali, and John Carlos. His expertise is sought after on shows such as Outside the Lines, Morning Joe, and Democracy Now! Named one of Utne Reader's 50 visionaries who are changing the world, Dave Zirin has also been called the best sports writer in the United States by none other than the legendary writer Robert Lipsyte. Zirin began his career at a time when almost no one in sports media was willing to acknowledge that not only could sports be political, they already were political. His commentary and the questions he was willing to ask have helped shape sports media responses to the role sports have played with respect to issues such as paid patriotism, economic development, gender equity, racial discrimination, labor rights, and much more. In addition, Zirin has consistently used his platform to share stories that have been ignored or forgotten, to respond to athletes who do want to amplify their political voice, and to foreground writers and thinkers from groups far too often underrepresented in sports media. In spite of the criticism Zirin has leveled against sports, and there are many, he remains hopeful that the joy and possibilities found on the courts and fields can be celebrated and allow us to fashion a better world. We're delighted to have him here to talk about his film and the politics of the NFL and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Dave Zirin. All right, Dave, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, let me put this down. So
we got the director's chairs
do this
here.
thing. I don't know. Is this right? Did I get it right?
That's good.
Right, good.
Yeah, as long as McConaughey will give you this, but you can if you're there.
Yeah, this is called pandering. How you doing?
We'll work with it. Thanks for being here.
Great.
It's great to welcome you to Austin and to UT. And thank you so much for giving us the film. I want to start. I know it's a labor of love, and that also brings with it some labor pains. you sat in the back of the room as we were screening the film, and I know that there were points where you felt like it was important to step away or kind of hide from view almost. Can you explain to us why the film, having created it, why the film evokes those reactions for you?
Yeah, and first, let me just say it's great to be here. I've shown the film also at Ohio State and Texas A&M. So it's good to show it at places where there is a culture of football, because you get very interesting conversations. Look, the basics is that I've seen this film now 600-700 times in about 1,000 different forms, and yet it also deals with people who are, some of them are close to me in my life. So Pat Tillman's mom, Danny, is someone very dear to me, for example. It's like I can't watch about Pat Tillman 700 times. Like it actually hurts to watch it. There are no calluses. There is no protection from feeling the pain of that family. I mean, and that goes across the board on all the issues of gender violence is something that is something that's affected my family. The issue of violence, state violence against Black Americans is an issue that I've been involved with, and I've worked along with. There's a former basketball player named Atan Thomas who I do a show with, and he's deeply involved with the families of people who've been affected, and he's introduced me. So to actually have to go through that and watch the film again and again and see these images it's not easy. And in a weird way, I'm sort of glad it's not easy, because otherwise then you're just sort of consuming it as content instead of, feeling it in your heart, which I really do.
So that speaks to the fact that there are a number of themes and images in the film that we get repeated instances of. And I think one of the strengths of the narration here is it's easy sometimes when criticisms are raised of something like the NFL for people to say, you're blowing it out of proportion, you're reading too much into it, and those who do critical work like you do hear that kind of commentary. But we see so many iterations of the examples that you're talking about here. Can you give us some insight into the process by which you wrote the narration and worked with the other people involved in the film to create the images, to be able to create that kind of impact?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, the other thing about why I got to put my head down, I just have to include this too, is that my son now plays high school football, and I don't want him to. But, when you're 14 and you really want to do something, especially coming out of the pandemic, it's very difficult to stand in between your son and this incredibly deep passion that he has to do this thing that I believe to be kind of inherently destructive. I mean, medically destructive by any conceivable level. So it's difficult also to watch very much the violent stuff on the field, because it's very difficult not to project my own child in that situation. So, and believe me, this is quite the headache in our house. My son has watched the film, and he looks at me afterwards and he goes, "Good film, Dad," and then walks away. So we haven't exactly had the deep talk, but he has watched the film. Look, the main thing that we wanted to do with this film was, like, anybody can have an opinion about the NFL, anybody can sound off about the NFL, anybody can say what they don't like about the NFL. What we really wanted to do, and the importance, I think, of the documentary form, is this idea that with images you can really back it up. And so what we wanted to do is we didn't just want to say, the Washington football team name, that was a bad name. It's like, okay, we're going to go through and explain this step by step of what the roots of it are. Or the whole question about masculinization and feminization and the role of football in terms of like a masculine panic in this country. It's like, it's one thing just to show, clips of the late Rush Limbaugh. It's another thing to actually go back and say, hey, let's look at the 19th century and walk people through that this is the space that this sport has always played in our society.
But these are repeated iterations, aren't they?
Yes, over and over. Like find a decade, you'll find the resurgence of these ideas and tropes. And to me, it's funny too, because we're not very good at history in this country, not to shock anybody. But we're not very good at that. And so to me, it's like you hear this a lot on multiple levels, but you hear some of these arguments about masculinization and feminization, and people think these are new. And people think like, oh my God, what's happening in 2023 that's ruining young boys? What's happening right now that's ruining men? And Tucker Carlson says something like, you have to shine UVA rays on your testicles or else, you know, you're gonna become feminized. You know, and so it's people think like in the present tense, especially in this country. People live in the present tense and they're just like, okay, there's a problem right now. And not every generation, there's been older folks, older men, who think the young boys don't have what it takes to step up and lead. And there are some exceptions to this historically, like the generation that came out of the Depression and World War II. But seriously, you go back to any time in the post-Civil War era, you see this sense of concern in the United States that something that we have is somehow slipping away. And it's slipping away because men are not allowed to be men. And it's this repeated cycle over and over again. And I think it's important to identify that because I think it's empowering, frankly, because otherwise we just live in this state of panic at the latest news cycle and not thinking, okay, people have dealt with this before.
So one of the ways that that shows up, and I think especially powerfully, is through the film's use of NFL films footage. Yeah. There's so much of that, and Dave and I are both members of Generation X, and I think products of the various forms of media that come along with that. And so as a kid, you know, watching ESPN's replays of NFL films and becoming enculturated to football through these images, and as a fellow critic of these issues, I recognize when I hear John Facenda's voice and I hear that Sam Spence soundtrack and see those images in slow motion, I respond to it viscerally like I did when I was 11, 12 years old, and it's hard to sort of dissociate from that. So how much did you think about NFL films as a conscious choice there?
Oh my God, and this is one of the things that I think is hard to impart to a younger generation in this regard, but being a sports fanatic growing up and not having 24-hour sports coverage meant that you had to seek things out from, you know, we all had collections of Sports Illustrateds, even those of us who did very badly in school and wouldn't read a book on a dare. We had our Sports Illustrateds sky high, and that's why I was so excited that you have the Frank DeFord lecture series here, because that's what made me want to be a sports writer, and made me want to write in general, not even sports writer, was reading Frank DeFord in Sports Illustrated. But it also meant that NFL Films was appointment viewing for people who were into the NFL, which I certainly was growing up, and this idea of we can consume the National Football League through this particular product. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what is this product? Because we would have watched anything, honestly, that had NFL on it.
Australian rules football was on. We'd watch that, right?
Oh, absolutely. Whatever's on, we're seeing it. But then we're watching this very stylized, highly political, and highly cultural form of expression about a league. And so every time they say the NFL, well, that's just a sport. It's like the very people who, like NFL Films, they're myth makers. You know, they're not documentarians. And I don't say that as a derisive at all. Like they're trying to project something about the league that makes it, you know, something like almost like a fairy tale, like the Knights of the Round Table, like this intense male pursuit of both violence and glory. And oh my God, we ate that up. But I'll tell you one very cool thing, and this is tough to impart. But because the absence of phones, the absence of all that stuff, it's like when I was in college, like Sports Center or when NFL Films was on, that was like appointment viewing. And so people of all different political stripes, we would gather in our dorm, you know, the common room, and the TV would be there, and we'd all watch it together. So if we wanted to know the latest about what was happening with Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, for example, in the story that we told at the start here, it's like there was no take out my phone and hit the next thing. I mean, you would show up to watch Sports Center at 7 p.m. in that dorm space and be able to have a collective experience of trying to figure out what it was all about. So, I mean, that was immeasurably useful in terms of just becoming someone who would think critically about sports.
I'm curious if I could ask the folks in the crowd by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's story? So a handful, and I think generationally, I think I can spot the difference. There's a new documentary about that.
Quite good.
What What would be different about his story today, do you think, as you talk about SportsCenter and social media and the like?
So different, because I think there's a part of the power structure of messaging in sports that's been completely inverted. So when Mahmoud Abdul Rauf was coming up, and I'll name a couple other people as well who paid the price for being political, Craig Hodges and a player named Olden Polynice, and I got to tell Olden Polynice's story because I think it's really instructive. When these folks were projecting their politics, people understood them through the lens more than anything else of newspaper columnists. Big-time columnists, big-time papers in big cities. That's how the ideas of what was taking place and the terms of the debate were filtered. Now, who were these columnists? They tended to be not just old, male, and white in their perspective, but it wasn't just that. It was that these jobs changed about as often as popes. So they would hold these positions for decades and decades and decades. So this idea of new voices or new perspectives about what was taking place just wasn't there. So Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, traitor. You know, that happens today. I mean, there would be, I think, immediately a social media campaign supporting him in his politics and supporting him in what he was trying to do. And of course, there would be other people denigrating him and not saying he shouldn't do it. But the point is that he would have an audience through social media that he was really denied back in 1996. And I'll tell you, like, I've interviewed Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, and this is just interesting side note to this, is that he was the reason that got me really into this space, was learning about him. And I tried to interview him for years and years and years, and I got in touch with him several times, and he was always a big no, because he felt so incredibly burned by what he went through in 1996. He didn't want to talk, and I understood that, and it sucked. But then after Colin Kaepernick started kneeling, and then Colin went down and actually met with Rauf, and they did a photo together and whatnot, and his confidence returned. And we did speak, and I found that his reasons for why he did what he did were so different than what I even thought. Like, I respected him in 1996 because I was just like, yeah, you know, that shouldn't be compulsory, coming out for the anthem. He doesn't think that. But I didn't know that his ideas about it were completely tied in to reading he was doing about U.S. foreign policy, while the media at the time presented it as a function of his conversion to Islam. Which was a part of it, for sure, but part of it was that his conversion to Islam had him looking at the United States in a different way than growing up in Gulfport, Mississippi. Like, it sort of removed him from the space he was in and had him thinking critically. In other words, it was much more complicated. Now, Olden Polynice is another example of this, because he's from Haiti, and in 1993, Bill Clinton went back on a campaign promise to let in HIV-positive Haitian refugees into this country. So Olden Polynice went on a hunger strike in protest during the NBA season. This is during the season. You just stopped eating. And he was crushed for it by the media on total shut up in playgrounds. And why are you bringing politics into sports? And he folded in the face of that, understandably, because he wasn't getting any support for what he was doing. It was just making his life more difficult. And I think if that happened today, there would be #WeStandWithOlden. There would be, you know, fans coming out to stadiums with signs, you know, of support. And there would also, yes, be people denigrating him as well. But I think when you talk to these players now, like, this idea of feeling like there is support popularly for what they're doing is really important for their own confidence.
Yeah, I wanted to extend on that idea, because the link to Abdul Rauf and Kaepernick is, I think, a good one. And the film emphasizes the negative reaction to Kaepernick, in part because you're looking at it through the lens of the league itself. But there were a lot of people who were supportive of Kaepernick. And it suggests that there is some public appetite for being able to address some of these issues. What makes that possible in some cases and not others?
Well, two things. I mean, first of all, the question is never just about what happens on the field, it's what happens off the field. So the fact that Colin Kaepernick only was Colin Kaepernick because there was this broader movement called Black Lives Matter, that was the context by which he felt like he needed to play his part. So that part is really critical. Like, what's the broader context? I mean, this is what makes, to me, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, people like him, so exceptional in really standing out in 1996 because he was upset at U.S. foreign policy without there being a movement to inspire him or support him. For him, it came straight through books in terms of why he did what he did. But with Kaepernick, it really was a reflection of a much broader struggle that was out there. And the second thing I would say, and I can't hammer this point home enough, is that when Colin Kaepernick would take a knee, the headlines would always say, oh, this is polarizing America. But when you drill down into the actual numbers and the polls and who was saying what, you realize that, and this is what speaks to the question of an audience, that it was really polarizing white America. I mean, because there was firm majority support among black Americans, and there was mixed support among white Americans. And that's really where the battle was, which is so interesting because the framing in this country is always about like black and white, but really there was an argument that needed to happen and didn't happen in white America about do we support this or do we not, and why.
Well, it was so easy at the time to translate the act of protest that Kaepernick was very clear was based on racial injustice and violence, and translate that into a statement on patriotism and ownership of the flag by the military.
Yeah.
Often not by members of the military, but on people who speak on their behalf.
Yeah, and again, it's like this is one of the things like documentary film, like us to be able to do the part of the film about vets for Kaepernick. Like, I feel like that's a story that could get lost to history, that there was this significant group of vets who were trying to stand with Colin Kaepernick, just like there's a significant group of vets who served with Pat Tillman who want the real Pat to be known. And I can't tell you how many emails I got from people connected to the armed forces, some of whom served with Pat after the Super Bowl did their tribute. And it hurt people in his family, like it hurt them. That they don't mind that the NFL is supporting the foundation, which does amazing work. They want Pat's memory to be alive, so it's not like they're against him being named in the called in the Super Bowl and celebrated, but to not say the manner in which he died, to them perpetuates a fiction that they all say uniformly Pat would have despised.
Well, that speaks to a second recurring theme in the film. I think I would argue there are two dominant images in the film that can kind of summarize the range of issues. One is Kaepernick. We can filter a lot through Kaepernick, and the other is 9/11. And the degree to which so much of the presentation of politics and sports has been affected by that. And what's interesting is that we're presumably a nation currently not at war. Just 2 days ago was the anniversary of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the 20th anniversary, so we're seeing a lot of reflections on that. But as we've moved further and further away from what we once called the war on terror, sports, and the NFL in particular, have dug in more and more on military imagery, it seems. How do we explain that relationship when the appetite in the public seems to have moved away from militarization, that our sports worlds have just continued to move toward it?
Yeah, first, I can't recommend enough Howard Bryant's book, The Heritage, which is interesting because talking to Howard about it, like he really was writing two books that he realized needed to be one book. One book was about how 9/11 changed the sports landscape, and one book was about the history of black resistance in sports. And he realized he couldn't tell really one of those stories without the other. And it's an interesting argument because 9/11 so politicized the sports world on ways that were very fundamental, like the importance of players coming out for the anthem, which starts, I believe, in early 2000s. Not something that had existed in the 80s. So when people were like, players have been doing this for decades, what is Kaepernick doing? It's like, no, they've been doing it a few years. It's like way back when Twilight came out is when it all started. So I think that when it comes to Kaepernick and the military and that nexus with the NFL, I think it has to do with how lucrative it is, and like very formal commercial partnerships between the Pentagon and the National Football League, because it serves both parties at the same time. Because the armed forces has had since 9/11 a recruitment crisis. And so you associate with the NFL, which is only the biggest cultural force in the United States. Obviously, that does very good things on that end. And it also speaks, I think, to a lot of young working class men who played high school football and then find themselves at a loss afterwards in terms of that intense kind of camaraderie. And it's put forward that, well, the military can be the place where you find that. And so that connection then becomes like cemented.
I'm thinking about the new commercial featuring Jonathan Majors for, I think it's for the Army. It's for one of the branches of the military. Army, thank you all. And of course it emphasizes what military recruiting has emphasized for so many years, right? It's about the lifestyle, it's about the experience, it's about being able to help people, and it never confronts the reality of the possibility of combat.
Well, it also doesn't confront the aftermath. I mean, today, I took a lift to the airport to come here and end up getting in a long conversation with my driver, who's a former Marine, who is trying to get benefits, and he's driving an Uber because he can't get the benefits, which are supposed to be about $3 grand a month, and he was in the burn pits, which have gotten a lot of publicity recently because Jon Stewart has taken that issue up. The burn pits are when they just dumped like fuel into these huge pits as a way of disposing with them, and the people who did those jobs have all kinds of horrible after effects. He's got tinnitus, he can't deal with noises, and he can't get these benefits. And he said to me, he said, they love us when we're overseas, and they ignore us when we're back home. And I mean, that's actually something that a lot of the players talked about. Like there were a lot of players in the NFL, and this shouldn't surprise us demographically. It actually makes perfect sense that a lot of players come from military families, including Michael Bennett and Martellus, his brother, come from military families. And it's because they're from military families that they felt like they needed to speak out for equality in the United States. Like, they don't see these things as disconnected. They see one as everything to do with the other, which is interesting because you see the mirror image of that as the other side, who say, oh, you're taking a knee against the anthem because of police violence. Well, that's inherently against the military. That's inherently against the people who are serving. While, you know, like I'm saying, the flip side is that actually that does honor to the service, because what kind of country do we really want to live in anyway?
Well, and of course, you include the story of Nate Boyer, who is a UT graduate, as part of the story of negotiating that and recognizing that taking a knee could be a sign of reverence. It is interesting that the claim has been made, and again, it's not necessarily people who are affiliated with the military making the claim, that the flag is owned primarily or even exclusively by people who have served in the armed forces, that the flag cannot be claimed by teachers and nurses and laborers and dissidents, that being patriotic can take multiple forms. And obviously the act of protest, as we've seen from so many athletes in recent years, is one of those acts of patriotism.
Yeah, one would think so, and one would hope so. That you know, the same country that you know, celebrates Dr. King every year, I mean, would be a country that would see the value of protest. Of course, we're seeing, you know, the opposite of that. I mean, that's a much bigger discussion, but the reaction against teaching not just Black history in this country, but literature, you know, it is really, really striking. I mean, I live right near Virginia. I live right outside of D.C. on the Maryland side, but in Virginia, you've got libraries banning Toni Morrison's books. I mean, this is something that I never thought I would necessarily live to see, but there is really this attack against the very idea of Black studies. And I feel like one of the reasons why this attack is taking place is precisely because of what happened in 2020 and a broader backlash against, again, what were and never forget this, those were the largest protests in the history of the United States in 2020. And I think that there was a full-scale freak out in the face of that. And part of that freak out involves eliminating AP tests and banning books, and this effort to say that, quote unquote, critical race theory is somehow something that is hurting white people. And I feel it's one of those things where it's like even reckoning with that is difficult. Like, don't you want your kids to know the history of this country? to me, is like, as a former history major, is the thing that I posit. But like I said to start this, I just feel like that as a country, we do such a disservice to the study of history. And if we did a better job with it, I think it would actually, bring us close together, because facts are stubborn things, but we've lost the ability to even recognize facts as they are in front of us.
Well, and that narrative is clearly affecting the way we're thinking about these conversations in sports. Toward the end of the film, you talk about a sense of hope that the public actually was quite favorable to the idea that athletes should exercise their voice and use their platform. But more recent data suggests that that might actually be shifting backward again, that, all right, we had our moment, right? 2020 was it. You all had the chance to speak. Now can we just move on? And so one of the themes in your work is that there's a persistent optimism. In spite of the criticism, you remain a fan and you remain optimistic that things can be better. So where do you reconcile some of that movement with that optimism?
I think in the short term, the end of the film fails the subject. Hopefully in the long term, it'll be better. But in the short term, like when we were making this film, there was this idea that 2020 would be this jumping off point. And that's just not what we've seen over the last several years. And we talked before about the reasons for that. I mean, backlash, reaction, athletes, fear, non-guaranteed contracts in the National Football League, like all of these issues play into it. But I'm a big believer that, the wine is out of the bottle, so to speak. So you are going to see athletes in the National Football League speaking out, going forward and moving ahead. Because there's all sorts of things happening in the NFL that I think displayed themselves really dramatically after this several-year period of real quiescence when Damar Hamlin effectively died on the field and then was brought back to life of the Buffalo Bills. That was a flashpoint moment to me that you can't separate what happened in the aftermath of that to 2018, 2019, 2020, because the NFL, Roger Goodell, the person who said, "Black Lives Matter," In
that beautiful basement home video,
Yeah, this hostage video. Joe Buck, who's not some radical, said right on the broadcast, the NFL wants these players back on the field after a 10-minute break. Wants them back out there, and the players are in this state of trauma, and because they saw a person die on the field and brought back to life. I mean, it took the players then to get in touch with the union, stand up, and get the game canceled. And then I thought something else which needs to be said is that you didn't have 60,000 fans then like they're, in the old Coliseum in Rome screaming in anger, like, we paid for this ticket, we want to see blood. I mean, instead you saw prayer circles, you saw people leave in an orderly fashion, you saw a demonstration of humanity in the face of, I would argue, barbarism. So you've got humanity in the face of barbarism. Then you ask, well, what side is everybody on? The players were on the side of humanity. The coaches McDermott and Taylor were on the side of humanity at that moment. Where was Roger Goodell? He spent the next, you know what he was doing? He was spending the next several days spinning Damar Hamlin's near death into another NFL film style. And this is why NFL film still matters, because it speaks to how they create and spin these stories. Even though it's not the force it once was. You basically had an NFL Films moment of Damar Hamlin survives because of the heroism of the NFL staff, and the Buffalo Bills are America's team. And I don't know if people saw, this is just how cold the fairy tale spinning structure of the NFL is. If people saw the playoff game between the Bills and the Bengals that then took place, the entire first half was about Damar Hamlin and the announcers talking about the Bills as America team. And then when it became very clear that the Bengals were just kicking the absolute crap out of the Bills, Damar Hamlin's name just wasn't said then for the rest of the broadcast. And then it became about Joe Burrow and the Bengals and look at them. So it's like they're always quick with these incredible stories. And it's ingenious, really, because it's like you can take any negative and try to spin it into a positive, and not just into a positive, but into yet another myth. And that's actually what made Kaepernick so I think unintentionally revolutionary, because all sorts of myths can be spun by the NFL. They can put things in the end zone. They can say Black Lives Matter. They're great at spinning these incredible stories, but they all have to come from the top. You know what I'm saying? And so as soon as a player imposed his own narrative on this very authoritarian top-down league, it was almost like pulling the string of a sweater, and they freaked out the more naked they got.
I think that's a great connection to work back from Hamlin back to Kaepernick. But I'm really glad you mentioned Damar Hamlin, because it was after that incident that I said we've got to have this film and have this event. And so the ability of the NFL to turn that into a feel-good narrative, and you can write the Disney script now if it isn't already in production, right? You can imagine the film that's going to be made about the inspirational story of the player who lived, and he says he wants to play again, and you can only imagine what would happen when he takes the field in uniform again. But before we turn it over,
side note about Damar Hamlin, he also now has his contract guaranteed, which it took actually a sort of outrage, because there was this public recognition that lasted about a day. And then the NFL, again, moving very agilely and very quickly, we're like, all right, it's $3 million. Let's just pay him the $3 million and say, turn this into yet another chapter in the feel-good story, and not, oh, you got hurt? Well, you're screwed.
Yeah, you talk about the fact that we have only 3.5 years as the average length of a player's time in the NFL. That the injury rate is 100%, and what a lot of fans don't realize, you see the big dollars. Those dollars are not guaranteed. Right. An NFL contract, unlike say a Major League Baseball contract, not guaranteed, and that's going to eventually. I want to lead that to a particular point before we turn it over to the audience for questions. The Damar Hamlin story also, as you talk about, really reflects on the importance of collective action. It wasn't one player that said, well, I don't want to play. It was the players together. And if we think about some of the more impressive moments where athlete voices have been able to really have an impact, it's about that collective, which makes me think about collective bargaining and labor issues. So as we think about political possibilities, how do we translate the individual heroic acts that we we have the tendency to focus on into more of those collective behaviors?
I mean, I think it starts by understanding that, the team concept itself can be very debilitating or very empowering. It's like fire that can either cook a meal or burn down your house. And so I wrote this book called, it's a short book called The Kaepernick Effect, which is basically just about high school and colleges where young people decided to take a knee because they were inspired not just by Colin Kaepernick, but by the broader movement. And I interviewed like 100 people and just found out what happened to their lives after they took a knee and what it meant to them and all this. And one of the things after talking to all those people that I was able to draw out is the people who had an experience that was empowering and changed their life, it was because they had teammates supporting them. And the people who had horror stories about being ostracized and kicked off teams and having their families threatened, having to move in some cases, having small siblings violently threatened, I mean, like terrible stories, that was usually when a person acted alone. And there's a real lesson there, because I played on teams growing up, and one of the powerful things about it for me growing up in an incredibly stratified, polarized New York City in the late 80s and early 90s was that it allowed you to feel like you were part, in the right context, that you were part of a family, and therefore you had to care about what your teammates were going through. So it made me care about racism. It made me care. My best friend on my basketball team growing up was Iranian. It made me care what his family was going through in ways that honestly I wouldn't have cared otherwise. But of course it has the flip side too. It's not all, I mean, anybody who's had a negative experience in the sports world knows that it can also be kind of ugly.
Yeah, we do. We like to celebrate the lessons of sports, especially youth sports, but the solidarity that is there is absolutely real. We have microphones at the end of each aisle for those of you who might want to come up and ask questions as you think about doing that, and I encourage you not to be shy and come on up. It also occurs to me, just to follow up on that observation about solidarity, you mentioned the context for Colin Kaepernick. It was athletes in the WNBA who were actually wearing Black Lives Matter shirts before Kaepernick took a knee, and then it was the WNBA players that said, we're going to collectively respond in the Georgia Senate election, right? That collective solidarity has been modeled in some other places that's really impressive, but I think we've got a question here, so please go ahead.
Just quickly about the WNBA, I think it's stirring that while you have these individuals like Maya Moore who are going to be remembered forever for how they were part of the movement, you often think about it in terms of team, like the Minnesota Lynx did this, the Seattle Storm did this, and that speaks to the collectivity that you're talking about, and it made them powerful, and it even changed how ownership in the WNBA started looking at their own league, as Kate Fagan really demonstrates brilliantly in her upcoming book, Hoop Muses, which we were talking about.
So do you think that this whole guarantee contract Lamar Jackson mess is happening because he's black?
No. Or maybe, I don't know. I shouldn't say no so quickly. I don't know. I don't trust any of these people. But I do think it's really staggering that Roger Goodell just got a contract extension and Lamar Jackson still doesn't have a contract. And Roger Goodell is going to be paid a lot more than Lamar Jackson. I think there is a certain devaluing of the skills that Lamar Jackson has, which are traditionally associated with black quarterbacks. And I also think that among NFL management ranks, there's no recognition or appreciation that Lamar Jackson is also the Ravens' best runner. And so he's putting a double burden on his own career and should be paid as such, because it's very likely that his career is going to be profoundly shorter than Tom Brady's because of the punishment that he takes, and that should be recognized contractually. And the fact that they don't, I think, represents a devaluing of his labor.
Again, don't be shy with questions. We encourage you to come on up. What didn't make it...
Such a sensitive topic, though, because if you walked into my son's room right now, you would think that Lamar Jackson's kid lived there because there's so many posters up on the wall. So if he's not on the Ravens next year, there's going to be such a crisis in my house. I can't even.
Your household is Ravens fans, not Commanders?
It's all Ravens. I'm not a fan. But when it comes to kids, when it comes to in-laws, I mean, it's purple and black all the way.
Fair enough, fair enough. As you talk about being a New York sports fan, I'm a Chicago sports fan, and so when I see Justin Fields' career in front of him, I see a lot of parallels to Lamar Jackson, so it certainly resonates. The Bears did sign a backup quarterback, P.J. Walker, who is black, and that is unusual, based on the things you were talking about. I have lots of questions, so I will keep asking them, but what didn't make it into the film that you wish you could have addressed?
Well, it's interesting. Actually, largely nothing. The Media Education Foundation, they make these films. I've done with them before. I've done some with them before. They really want to top out at 58 minutes so it can be effectively shown in a college setting and then have time afterwards. So we fought for that half hour to go to 90 minutes. We were just like, there is way too much. We don't want to leave out X, Y, or Z. So we packed in everything that we felt like needed to be there. And then the toughest part was the whole moving target question. When do you, if you're an artist, for example, if you're a portrait painter, when do you put down the brush? If you're writing a book, when do you say, okay, I'm pushing this away and I'm going to hand it over to my editors, and at that point, it ain't yours anymore. And similarly with this, it was you see, we have the Brian Flores story in this, we have the John Gruden story in this. Both of those were really pushed in to be how do you do a film without this?
And still not resolved, the Brian Flores case.
Right, still not resolved. And we could have very, very easily just kept waiting to put the film out. I mean, we talked about Damar Hamlin. I mean, I could name half a dozen other issues that have come out since the film's end that we could have discussed in greater detail, not the least of which the thing that we started with. A good friend of mine who's a sports writer said to me that I really like the film, but you might need to accept that it's a time capsule in that it sums up, I think very effectively, like that period 2012, 2020. But like I said early on, like I was hoping, and it still may be, that 2020 was going to be this launching pad to seeing like 1,000 flowers bloom. And we're still wrestling with that not being the case, and really wrestling with the question of like, well, how do we make that the case? Like, how do we do that? And the one thing that's clear to me is, is that it starts off the field, and it may not be reflected in sports. Like in the 1980s, it was reflected through this new form called rap music. It wasn't reflected in sports. The fact that there was a lot of pain and dislocation in this country. So it's going to flame up somewhere. Historically, sports has been a major cog in the wheel of struggle and social change. Will it be going forward? We're going to have to see. I mean, I'm of the belief that the wine is out of the bottle, and we're going to see more of this as conditions change, as broader social conditions change. But it's not something that's happened over the last several years.
Yeah, I think do you have a question here? Yeah.
One, just thank you for the film. It was the first time I've seen like that kind of like deep historical background, like going that far back. But I was just gonna ask, given its historical unequal power dynamics, can you realistically see a future where class disparities, whether ultimately stemming from like deep-rooted racism or otherwise, won't at some level continue to define the structure of the NFL? And if it does, how do you think it would like maybe threaten it in the long run?
That's a great question. I mean, I actually think, it's quite all the trends are moving in the other direction. Because you look at things like Pop Warner numbers, what you're seeing more and more is that suburban families are keeping their kids out of football, which makes it more and more a sport of desperation, more and more a sport. I'll never forget after Hurricane Katrina wrecked New Orleans. Well, it wasn't the hurricane, it was the breaking of the levees, wrecked New Orleans in 2005. I was down there looking at the sports angle of it all, and found out that like an incredible percentage of NFL players come from that little inch of ground on a map in that area of the Gulf. Like a huge percentage come from there. And I asked a coach why that is, and he said 3 things, racism, poverty, year-round sunshine. Perfect soil for NFL players. And that was 2005, and I think it's really been since then that we've gotten more recognition and knowledge about concussions, and so you've seen these trends accelerate, not decelerate. And the other dynamic in this is that the NFL has shown itself in recent years to care very much about optics. Like, for example, the Washington Commanders are about to be sold. I think what Roger Goodell wants from an optical perspective is black ownership. But what you're seeing, so it doesn't look like this apartheid sport like Michael Bennett describes, where it's segregated, because that's bad branding for them, because they, like all sports leagues, are concerned about people your age. Like they are all in this state of existential crisis of, wow, will young people growing up with so many entertainment options or distractions or whatever you want to call it, will football still be the place where they go? And there's a recognition that if they're going to be able to get a commercial audience of a generation that is more diverse and less tolerant of intolerance than any generation in the history of this country, it can't look like it looks. But one of the things that this Commander sale, which, I live there, so I've been following it closely, one of the things it's revealing is that Roger Goodell really has no power other than the power to be able to be sort of like this human meat shield in front of the scandals of the league. Not the shield, but a different kind of shield. A flat catcher, as Tom Wolfe called him in the early 70s. But he's great at catching flack, but he's not the person with the power. So will these 31 NFL franchise owners accept integration into their ranks? That's a question that looks like it's trending towards no. even though they understand, like Roger Goodell and the more forward-thinking people are thinking, wow, this is not going to look good going forward.
As much as that answer gives us the temptation to talk about Jerry Jones, we're about out of time, so we've got one more question.
Hi, Dave.
Hi.
Maybe this is because I co-hosted a podcast called Burn It All Down, but you're talking about hope, and I obviously have my own difficult relationship with football at this point. It's interesting to me that, like, when I hear you talking, it's a lot about, like, can we reform? Can we get some players out there, and can we reform this league? And I'm wondering, like, why aren't we just arguing that we should not have this league, like, or this sport? Like, so what's the argument that this should even exist at this point?
Well, as Jessica, who co-authored a book called How to Love Sports When It Doesn't Love You Back, I think that's a framing of the question too. And I think it's that your book is actually a way, to me, where I start, which is a great book and everyone should get it, but it says to me about, like, a framing of how to answer that very question. Because, like, what do you do with a sport that is this, it's almost like a too big to fail thing. Like, to say abolish the NFL, it really is like saying abolish America, abolish capitalism. Like, it becomes, it's a big picture thing. And so then it becomes like, okay, well, if we're not, like what are the intermediate steps if this sport isn't going to go away anytime soon? And what should we be offering solidarity towards? And what lessons do we think can be drawn from this, which could help other people in struggle? So, like, supporting NFL labor struggles, for example, becomes really important because it's a way then to talk about labor with other people, or supporting NFL players' efforts to be heard on questions of racism, or supporting women in the NFL speaking out about the entrenched sexism in the league. It's like, how do we offer solidarity to them while also not getting ahead of them? Because they're not saying to tear it down, but they are tearing it down or burning it down in interesting ways. I did this event at Ohio State with Malcolm Jenkins, and one of the things that he said, he's in the film, he's one of the people raising a fist. He was a Pro Bowler with New Orleans and Philadelphia. He said, he said, once I stopped trying to hurt people on the field, I stopped hurting. And he talked about how there is, like, this culture now among players, and talking about in the locker room about basically how do you survive week to week, not how to become the big macho heavy hitter, how to, prove yourself by destroying yourself, but how do you function in something that is inherently destructive? And so I'm more thinking in terms of, like, how do we support the people creating little fires everywhere? Because I just don't see the path to calling, in the immediate sense, to burn it all down. But but I'm so sympathetic to the question, because it's like, as exciting as football can be, I mean, 3 hours of commodified violence, I mean, and when, like I said in the film, like, perfectly made for television, as exciting as it can all be, it's like, when I think about we were talking about this earlier, when I think about what a more just society would look like, of course it would contain sports of all kinds. Because as long as there's been humanity that could clothe and shelter itself, there have been sports. But would there be this sport in a more just society, where people didn't have to turn to it because of poverty, where people didn't feel funneled into it because they don't see another out of rural Florida, for example? It's someplace you're familiar with. So that's where my head goes back to. So I only have this long meandering comment, not like a hard argument, but I just feel like in the immediate sense, what's the task? Like, how to support people inside who are trying to do the work.
So I said in the introduction that the film and Dave's commentary wouldn't tell you what to think, but would give you a lot to think about. And I think that last comment leaves us with that sentiment. I want to thank everybody for hanging in with us for so long. Thank you for being here, and a huge thank you to Dave Zirin, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you, Michael, so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks, University of Texas. Yeah, it's a cool spot. Thank you.